Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. Today we're going to have a little chat about rip-off films that are actually very good or highly enjoyable. Rip-off films is probably a little bit harsh and has negative connotations. How about films that were inspired by other films, which in some cases were inspired by other films or other things? Again, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure you'll have your own examples, which I would like to see in the comments if you want to take the time to do that. Again, this is not a serious and ultimate list or anything like that. This is just a bit of fun. Some of them you can't really call rip-offs. It was a matter of timing or whatever. But again, rip-off's a bit harsh. It's probably more inspired by. So let's start with a really obvious one that the director makes obvious in the title. It's Kim Ji-woon's The Good, the Bad, the Weird, starring Korean legends Byung-hun Lee and Kang-ho Song, which strangely enough was inspired by Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Now, unlike Leone's film, at 124 minutes, The Good, the Bad and the Weird is a little over long, but again, that's a minor gripe because it is still so much fun, even though it is derivative, obviously, of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. It's super cool, mainly due in part to the leads, especially Byung-hun Lee, clad in black as the mysterious gunman. There's a treasure map. It's three guys, the good, the bad and the weird. You can work out who's who, all searching for the treasure map. It has wonderful set pieces. There's a wonderful set piece that opens the film on a train, which again reminds us of another Leone film, Once Upon a Time in the West. It's just a love letter to Leone. It looks absolutely beautiful, especially on Blu-ray. And again, it's a perfect example of a film that wears its inspirations on its sleeve, but still isn't like derivative or just a cold, calculated copy of the original film. And that's kind of what we're looking for here. Films that might use the blueprint of other films but still do it in an interesting and fun and entertaining way. So that's The Good, the Bad and the Weird, and that gives you an idea of the concept. So next is Duncan Jones with Source Code, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Yes, I do seem to be a Jake Gyllenhaal fan because I do seem to have a lot of his films. And this one is fairly inspired by Groundhog Day, which obviously itself is inspired by other things, but source code's pretty much Groundhog Day. Jake Gyllenhaal wakes up on a train, and he doesn't really know how he got there, and it turns out he's in the army and he's pretending to be somebody else, and he's put on the train because there's a bomb in the train, and the bomb goes off, he dies, and he wakes up in a strange capsule or something. He's being contacted by Vera Farmiga, which isn't her name, but that's what I call her. And he keeps getting sent back because he's got to figure out where the bomb is and who put the bomb on the train and why. Again, it just uses that repeated 14 minutes, the same way Groundhog Day uses the same shots as Bill Murray tries to figure out what the hell's going on and escape the day. Source Code isn't as metaphysically deep as Groundhog Day. It doesn't have as much to say, but it is a fun little sci-fi actioner, and Jake Gyllenhaal gives another nice little Jake Gyllenhaal performance. So that's Source Code, directed by Duncan Jones, who did Moon and is the son of David Bowie. Next is a fairly obvious one, but an example of the film that was inspired by it is better than the original as far as I'm concerned. It's Outland by Peter Hyams, starring Sean Connery and Peter Boyle and Francis Sternhagen, which is inspired by High Noon. It's often called High Noon in Space, but I actually think it's better than High Noon. I think it's one of the most underrated science fiction films of all time. There's a really interesting video on YouTube which suggests Outland actually takes place in the Alien universe. As far as the mining planet, it's not too much of a stretch to think that it's actually in the same universe as Alien. This is absolutely wonderful. It's one of Sean Connery's best performances. And again, it's a film that for years, when it was on the television, you never really saw where the money was spent on production design. It was always dark and murky and you couldn't really see what was going on. But now that it's actually been released in Blu-ray, it looks amazing. Yeah, there's some matte work that stands out, as matte work tends to do sometimes in Blu-ray. But the film looks absolutely gorgeous. It has that gritty, depressed view of the future that it has with Alien. I would actually go out on a limb and say that Outland I actually prefer to Alien now. Sean Connery is the Marshal. Again, there's Marshals in Alien Resurrection, so again, it's not uncommon in the Alien universe. And strange things are happening to some of the workers on this mining colony, and Sean Connery investigates, which leads to a kind of High Noon showdown at the end of the film. It's just a wonderful film. I mean, Peter Hyams is one of those directors that's in the workmanlike bracket. He did 2010. Obviously made 9 years after 2001. And again, solid workmanlike type director. But I mean, I absolutely love Outland, and for me it's better than the film that inspired it. So next is a couple of my favourite derivatives of an absolute classic. It's John McTiernan's 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas, and Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars, written by John Sayles. And of course, as you'll know, they were kind of inspired by Seven Samurai. John Sayles is a huge Kurosawa fan. He wrote the script for Corman. Again, it's just two kind of interesting takes on it. Obviously, Seven Samurai's been remade so many times, but these two are the better versions, as far as of that kind of inspiration of a bunch of warriors with different personalities get put together to go on a mission to save people. You have Norseman and Antonio Banderas's Arab out of place. I've did a video on the wonderful Banderas vehicle. He'll appear later in this list. In Battle Beyond the Stars, again a low budget, but full of heart and character. Sybil Danning and George Peppard and Robert Vaughn, who of course was in The Magnificent Seven, which might actually be a remake of Seven Samurai itself. Again, Seven Samurai is just one of those template films that you can't help but be inspired by. And Battle Beyond the Stars and The 13th Warrior are two really good examples of films that, yes, can be inspired by film, but really good in their own right. Next is Haywire, Steven Soderbergh's beat 'em up, which I would say was kind of inspired by the Bourne films. But again, being controversial, I actually prefer Haywire to the Bourne films. I'm odd because my favourite Bourne film is the one with Jeremy Renner, not Matt Damon. Haywire stars Gino Carano as an agent who's double-crossed and then pretty much gets the fun job of beating the crap out of lots of A-list actors, which is really enjoyable. Michael Fassbender gets a good punching. Ewan McGregor gets a sweet kicking. Bill Paxton turns up as his dad and gives her dad, as gives a wonderful turn. Channing Tatum gets kicked about. Antonio Banderas again appears and has one of the greatest last lines in cinema history. And Michael Douglas turns up as a shady handler, as he does nowadays because of his age. It's a really enjoyable film. You can pick it up for really cheap money. It looks really nice. Again, it's perhaps unusual for Soderbergh, but he has made interesting little films. And for a pulp actioner, you can't go wrong with Haywire. And like I said, I actually prefer it to Bourne, even though it is, I would say, inspired by Bourne. The next one's perhaps not a rip-off because it was only made, I think, months after the other film. They were both made in 1971. And it's Villain with Richard Burton. And of course Get Carter is the more famous one with Michael Caine, not Sylvester Stallone. So they're both British gangster films. Villain is not as good as Get Carter, in my opinion. Get Carter was directed by Michael Hodges, or Mike Hodges even. This was directed by Michael Tushner, who did a lot of TV work, did a lot of Play for the Day. But this one, there's so much to like in it. It's kind of, Richard Burton's character is a kind of amalgam of both Cray brothers. So he has this homosexual relationship with Ian McShane, who's kind of a fixer. But again, at that time, cinema could only really express homosexual relationships with kind of sadomasochism, so he likes slapping Ian McShane about a bit, because you couldn't just show a homosexual relationship as being like normal. You had to kind of show it with some pathology to it in 1971. Richard Burton has a weird accent as an East End of London gangster, but you kind of get used to it. It has some amazing scenes, some amazingly brutal scenes. It's a who's who of acting, again, very much like Get Carter, which was set in the north. Michael Caine going up to the north to investigate his brother's death. Villain has this kind of rank East End smell, these locations in the East End. There's a brilliant robbery in the middle of the film of a factory, which is messy and loose and all over the place as things go wrong, but there's something brilliant about it because it's not, perfectly choreographed. It's not, obviously it was choreographed to be messy, but it's not efficient. It's just beautifully messy and real. Joss Ackland turns up as one of the crew, and he's like dyspeptic, so he has to eat like eggs and stuff during the heist, which is quite hilarious. Nigel Davenport as the cop. There's some bad language in it for 1971. It's just so good. Like I said, Ian McShane's in it. Who else is in it? It's Donald Sinden as a corrupt politician playing that Donald Sinden type character. You could argue it's more fun than Get Carter. And again, it just has a tremendous last scene. The kind of righteous indignation in Richard Burton of who he is and his identity and what he means to the community. Again, this is a vintage Studio Canal release. I would highly recommend picking it up and watching it as a double bill with Get Carter. Again, it's hard to call it a rip-off because they were both made within months of each other. It's more kind of the ignored stepchild who lives in the attic to Get Carter. Yeah, but they're both wonderful films. The next three aren't particularly scene for scene rip-offs or inspired by, but we have Deep Rising, Deep Blue Sea, and a scene from Alien Resurrection, which kind of reminded me of the Poseidon Adventure, directed by Ronald Neame, who I recently did a review of Chalk Garden, who did Hopscotch. It's actually quite an interesting director, again, kind of solid workmanlike parts. I did kind of refer to him as almost like a poor man's Richard Lester as far as star-studded casts, as far as doing lots of different kind of films. It's just I was watching the Poseidon Adventure again. I should probably pick it up on Blu-ray. And because as a child I remember watching it and kind of laughing at it a bit, laughing at kind of Red Buttons and obviously Shelley Winters. But watching it again, those scenes with Shelley Winters are actually quite moving, and it's such a brave performance, especially, you know, when she's swimming underwater, because at that stage of her career she was older. She was a larger lady at that point. But it's such a brave performance by her, and you actually genuinely feel for the characters. Ernest Borgnine, who spends most of the film shouting at everybody, you know, when he sees what happens to Shelley Winters, he genuinely has a really wonderful moment. Gene Hackman, who strangely enough spends most of the film shouting at people and pointing his finger, which to be honest he's done for most of his career. Again, when he sees what happens to Shelley Winters, he actually has a really good emotional performance, unlike the rest of the film, where again he's pretty much shouting at everybody and pointing his finger. And it just got me thinking, obviously Deep Blue Sea, the scene where they're climbing this cylinder which fills with water and fire, it's directly lifted from the Poseidon Adventure. Obviously Alien Resurrection, where they're swimming under the kitchen or through the kitchen, that's pretty much the Poseidon Adventure. And also Deep Rising, you know, instead of a big wave, it's a big tentacled monster that's capsized the ship. So again, maybe not an obvious rip-off or inspiration, but I think, yeah, looking back on the Poseidon Adventure, I think it's better than certainly I treated it as a child, or because there is some worth there. The remake, not so much. Yeah, but those three films, certainly scenes are directly lifted from the Poseidon Adventure, I would say. So next, I don't actually have the original film, even though I've seen it often and I probably should. But it's The Most Dangerous Game, which I believe was shot on the same location as King Kong. Obviously there'll be people watching who'll correct me if I'm wrong. But The Most Dangerous Game is one of those films that's been repeated and remade so many times, about the most dangerous game to hunt is man. But certainly one obvious inspiration or rip-off of that is Predator, John McTiernan's classic. There's actually two McTiernans on this list. I'm sure that's just coincidence. Predator is absolutely sublime on so many levels, as a comedy, as an action film. And for me, it's better than the source material. not much to say. We all know about Predator, and we all know about The Most Dangerous Game. Next is a French film that I wish I could find on Blu-ray, but it's not really available. It's The Nest, or Nid de Guêpe, starring a character who was in quite a lot of late Chabrol, if you were watching the Chabrol season. And this film is pretty much inspired by John Carpenter's Assault on Precinct 13, which of course was inspired by Rio Bravo, Howard Hawks. Nid de Guêpe is heavily influenced by Assault on Precinct 13. It has law enforcement taking a gun runner through this warehouse. It gets attacked, and they have to find shelter in this warehouse, but at the same time there's thieves robbing the warehouse, so you have these three factions all coming together, all trying to shoot each other. It's a lot of fun. It's nowhere near as good as Assault on Precinct 13, or even Rio Bravo, even not a huge fan of Rio Bravo because of John Wayne. Maybe if Rio Bravo had been made with Christopher Walken, perhaps it might be better. But The Nest is a lot of fun. It's one of those little gems that made in 2002, I think. Probably needs a Blu-ray release to get a little bit more exposure. The next couple, again, the film that was the inspiration for it has been done so many times before. Again, you can make your own list. But the two I'll just briefly talk about is Piranha by Joe Dante, written by John Sayles, and The Car, which is about a killer car in the desert with James Brolin. And no surprise, these were inspired by Jaws. The Car is absolutely ridiculous because it is essentially a car driving around and attacking people in the desert almost as if it's a shark. Obviously you could argue Duel is Jaws as well, but The Car is just so much nonsense, but it's actually a lot of fun. And as we know, Piranha is absolutely wonderful. I'm sure there's people who prefer Piranha to Jaws. Again, written by John Sayles, has its tongue firmly in its cheek, but it's just absolutely wonderful. Next, I'm going to finish with two James Belushi films, bizarrely. I didn't plan this, but it's just the way it kind of happened. And the first one is Mr. Destiny with Michael Caine, which is pretty much a rip-off of It's a Wonderful Life. Not with Michael Caine. The Capra classic about suicide and depression, but everybody seems to think it's a happy film. Mr. Destiny is pure cheese. When Jim Belushi was big, made in 1990. And again, it's about this guy who works in a dead-end job and thinks that all of his misfortune goes back to that one high school baseball game when he missed the pitch and struck out and cost the whole team the championship, and he didn't get the girl and he had to settle for Linda Hamilton as his wife. And he meets Michael Caine when his car breaks down in this suspicious bar, and it's a suspicious man who gives him a drink, which I believe is pink and frothy, but he somehow takes the drink anyway, in a deserted part of town. It's made in 1990, different times than now. People were a lot more naive in 1990. And he wakes up and Michael Caine takes him to his home, which is actually a mansion now, and he's married to, I've completely forgotten her name, Rennie Russo, and he's now the boss of the company. Linda Hamilton is the union leader, and he realises that the grass isn't perhaps greener on the other side. Again, it's cliched, it's predictable, but it's also a lot of fun. Obviously not as good as It's a Wonderful Life, my favourite Christmas suicide and depression film. And finally, again, I wasn't really planning this, but it just kind of happened, sadly. But Taking Care of Business, or Filofax, with the wonderful Charles Grodin, who sadly died very recently, which is pretty much a rip-off of Trading Places by John Landis. Now, of course, Trading Places is essentially based on the Prince and the Pauper story. Again, Filofax is not great. This is 1990 as well. Jim Belushi obviously cornered the market. It's predictable. It's, remember those Filofaxes, those big, thick, essentially laptops before computers were born, where people kept their entire lives in it. Well, James Belushi breaks out of prison because he wants to see the Cubs in the World Series, because at that point they hadn't been in the World Series for some time. It would actually be some time before they did appear in the World Series. And he somehow breaks out of prison. All the prisoners come together just to get him out so he can go and see a baseball game. It's a bit of a stretch. And he bumps into Charles Grodin, who's the businessman. He ends up getting his Filofax, taking over his life. Charles Grodin goes to the other end of the scale and tries to get his life back. Again, it's not rocket science. In actual fact, the only thing that is rocket science is actual rocket science. But it's a lot of fun, and it's another wonderful performance by Charles Grodin, who, again, it's subtle stuff that he does, very much like in Midnight Run. Just looks, expressions that are just so good. And he will be greatly missed. Directed by Arthur Hiller. Again, not a great film, but a lot of fun. And it just so happened to be an excuse to mention Charles Grodin and say thanks very much for Midnight Run and lots of other things. So thanks very much for watching this fairly rambling video. Again, leave your comments below, leave your examples of films that essentially ripped off other films but are actually very good or entertaining, or an okay watch or masterpiece, depending on your viewpoint. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, this is not an ultimate list, these are not ranked or anything. I'd be interested to see your examples, because no doubt I've completely missed hugely obvious ones. But let's have a discussion in the comments. So this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying thanks very much for watching, and it proves even if you don't have an original thought, you can still come up with something that's entertaining. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying bye.